All right, so we're in week 2 of Glory Days. As far as the introduction, we're going to actually start our chapters next week. So if you're seeing this next week, you'll want to read ahead, read chapter 1, and we'll get into that text and we'll start looking at that, and that'll take us into the book of Joshua. But these last 2 weeks, we've looked at first Exodus and the Israelite nation living basically in slavery in Egypt. And then this last week, we really spent our time about the Exodus, but after they came out, after they crossed through the Red Sea, and ultimately end up in the wilderness. And so we're in the book of Numbers. And as we're talking about that, we're looking at this idea. We're still looking at this idea of promise. The original promise that was given to Abraham to be a blessing, and God's promise covenant with Abram. And then this week we looked at the land promise, and we looked at it in 3 different ways: when it was made to Abram, when it was made to Isaac, when it was made to Jacob. That land promise is reiterated again to Moses as he begins to lead the people in the Exodus. But what we're coming to is, when they come to the land, do the people still stand on? Do they still understand? Do they still embrace that promise? Do they still believe that God is going to give them this land flowing with milk and honey, the place that they've been journeying to for X number of generations, for years and years and years, and is part of who they are. It's part of their history. And so we looked this week at that moment where they come to the edge of the land, and they've actually camped along the side of the land, and they send the scouts, one from each tribe. They send the scouts into the land to take a look at it, and Moses gives them a list and says, hey, go look at all these things and see what you think about that, and bring back a report. And as we know, the report that came back was that land was filled with people that were scary and that were stronger than the Israelite nation. And I wonder when Moses did that, recognize God told him to choose one from each tribe, but I wonder when Moses was sending out the scouts, if his expectation was that they were going to come back energized and ready to go, and if the purpose was to have a leader from every tribe come back and to have them be the cheerleader, to have them be the spokesperson for their tribe and say, hey, we're going into the land God has promised. It really is flowing with milk and honey. And how disappointed Moses and God were at the report that came back. I don't know. We know that it turns out bad, but I don't know what the original expectation was. So as you guys start your discussion this week, take a look, go to Numbers chapter 13, and look at the report when the scouts come back, beginning in verse 26, and read all the way through the end of the chapter. Caleb is the only one that stands up in the midst of that and says, hey, we need to go and take over this land. But they had the affirmation that this was a land flowing with milk and honey. But look at the report that comes back, and especially when you get to the end of that after they told Moses that, what we're told is that the Israelite leaders, that the scouts, went amongst the assembly, went amongst the congregation, the camp, and spread this report after they had told Moses that, to make sure that the people would basically go against Moses. Talk about that. Talk about how dysfunctional that seems. And then apply that to today. Where do we see that happening? How does that infiltrate? We know that those things can infiltrate church. We know that those things can infiltrate work. We know they can infiltrate families. But talk about that. Talk about an experience where you've been able to overcome that. Without going any further, staying at the end of Numbers chapter 13, I want to ask, are there places that we come to where we think we're just too weak? We just don't have the assets, we don't have the abilities, we don't have the strength to do something that we believe is good or right, or is part of even the purpose and ministry of the church. Because what the Israelite people saw was the opportunity, was the land that God had promised to them. But what they saw were the obstacles, not the opportunities. Talk about how it is we sometimes focus on our weakness instead of God's strength in trying to accomplish what is good and right in front of Him. Chapter 14 is when it really gets bad, really gets ugly. What we're told is that the whole congregation, the whole assembly basically says, hey, we want to go back to Egypt. We don't want to die out here. We don't want to die trying to get to the promised land. We're going to elect a new leader and go back to Egypt. And we came to that verse we talked about in service. And the people pick up stones, and they're going to kill Moses because they're so afraid of going into that land. They're so angry about the situation. Talk about places where you've been, on either side of that discussion, where you've been the one that was so angry you needed to elect a new leader, you needed to elect somebody else to follow. Or on the other side, where you've been trying to lead and you know that you've had the entire crowd, the entire workforce, the entire class turn against you. Talk about how those emotions control the situation, and what did we learn from it? We're moving on, and I'm going to ask you to look at a particular scripture that we didn't really talk about in service. I mentioned it, but we didn't really talk about it. Go to Numbers 14, verses 13 and following. And in 13 and following, you have this situation where God says He's going to basically destroy the Israelites and going to start over with Moses. And we have this time where Moses is interceding on behalf of the people. And he's talking about the fact that God is glorified, even though His people are in rebellion, that God is glorified because His power is being shown. So take a look at that all the way down through verse 25. Read that and then discuss that amongst yourself as far as the prayer, if we want to call it the intercessory prayer that Moses is having, and how we can do that for our communities and for our families and for the people we know, how we can intercede in that very same way and give God the glory. So, last question, and no great answers to this question, but go ahead and read through the end of chapter 14, and as you see there, God's punishment, if you will, upon the people is that for every day they scouted the land, they would spend a year in the wilderness, not going into the land. And ultimately, that everybody that was over 20 would not see the promised land. They were going to, their bodies would fall in the wilderness. Talk about that in the sense of mistakes that have consequences we can't undo. Because we obviously want to, as we talked about, we want to be defined by grace and we want to understand forgiveness. And certainly these folks, this generation could be forgiven. But even if they were forgiven, they were going to pay a consequence for what they had done. Talk about things in your life that have that type of earthly, temporal consequence, whether you're forgiven or not. And how do we deal with that? How do we continue on? How do we know that we're still children of promise, that we're still living in God's plan, even though we're suffering that type of consequence? All right, so this is the good news now, okay? We're going to get to Joshua. And Joshua is this time of incredible strength, this time of incredible blessing, incredible power being displayed by God. So read Joshua chapter 1. If you have time, do it in your group. If not, do it this week before you come to service, because we're going to launch into the glory days of Israel. We're going to launch into that moment where Israel is literally exalted by God to overtake the land and to become the nation. Join us this Sunday for Glory Days.